afternoon. I'm David Tunick, president of the IFPDA, and I'm here to welcome you to the 7th Annual Metropolitan Museum IFPDA Print Study Day. I'd like to say at the outset how extremely special the Print Study Day at the Met is to me, how personal it is. When I was a year or so out of college, my art history mentor at Williams, Professor Lane Faison, one of the original Monuments men, induced the legendary Hyatt Mayer at the Met to take me on in the study room as what I suppose today would be called an intern. I did that for 2 years. The first year, my assignment was Dürer engravings in the Met collection, and the second year, Rembrandt etchings. That experience was my true graduate school, and I shall always be grateful to the Metropolitan Museum, Hyatt Mayer, and the nearly forgotten but brilliant John McKendry, who followed Mr. Mayer as head of the print department. And so, as the world turns, about 15 years later, Egbert Haverkamp Begeman, the renowned 17th century Dutch scholar, institute professor, and Met curator, asked me to co-teach an instant seminar with him on Mannerist engravings. And who was among the young graduate students in that class? Nadine Orenstein, who went on, as most of you know, to join the Met print room staff, and now these past several years, its extraordinary head. Nadine shone brightly from the start. It is my delight today to introduce Nadine to you, though I'm certain a lot of you already know her and recognize her for her many achievements. Nadine has a profoundly deep knowledge of works of art on paper, ranging from old masters to modern. She is best known internationally as one of the world's foremost scholars in Dutch 17th century prints and drawings by artists such as Rembrandt, Hercules Segers, Bruegel, and Bosch. She's published a great deal and been behind many astoundingly revelatory and beautiful exhibitions. Nadine is your moderator for this session. A graduate of Barnard College, she earned her MA and doctorate from the NYU Institute of Fine Art. She will tell you about our program today and introduce the other distinguished speakers. The presentation will be followed by a Q&A. And so now, Print Study Day, presented by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in partnership with the IFPDA, Technical Innovation and Sociopolitical Impact in the 19th and 20th centuries. Nadine, over to you.
David, thanks so much for that fantastic introduction. I have to say that that class that you and Egbert taught really got me started in the field of Netherlandish prints and led to my dissertation topic. And I too was an intern in the prints and drawing or print department when I started out. So it's really been a great place for encouraging people to go into the field of works on paper. So I really am delighted to be here and to welcome you all to today's program. I could see from the people who have signed up or who are participating, it's an international audience, and that is what we can do so well these days via Zoom. I'm delighted to be here, and it's going to be a fascinating group of talks today that we have in store for you. They have been inspired, or the program itself has been inspired by several exhibitions that we have on view today or now at the Met, notably Art for the Millions, American Culture and Politics in the 1930s, as well as Manet, Degas. Both exhibitions have really been a critical and public success. We additionally have a wonderful display of works in our Johnson Gallery that features selections from the collection. And this rotation that's on now is organized around a number of new acquisitions. And so I really encourage you, if you are in New York, if you are in New York next week for the print fair, please do visit the museum. There is a lot to see. Before I introduce our three speakers, I want to thank, of course, our friends at the IFPDA, Jenny Gibbs and Michelle Stanek, for hosting this event during Print Month and being so generous, allowing us every year to take up one of the spots in Print Month for our Print Study Day. I also want to thank the people in my department who have helped brainstorm, organize, and really bring this study day together. Joanna Seidenstein, Allison Rudnick, Connie McPhee, and Mirseyedi have all been instrumental in getting this to you today. Now I will introduce all three speakers so that we can enjoy their presentations without any interruption. And then at the end, I will come back and we can have the Q&A. I want to remind you that the Q&A will take place at the very end. I should read my little script here before I talk off script. Of course, please feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A box that you can find the button at the bottom of your screen, and you can write in questions during any of the talks, and then we can get to them at the end of the session. So today we have the pleasure of hearing from three scholars on the subject of technical innovation in printmaking and its socio-political impact. Our first speaker is Allison Rudnick. Allie is Associate Curator here in the Met's Department of Drawings and Prints, where she oversees the visual, culture, and ephemera collections. Prior to joining the Met, she worked at the print shop and publisher Harlan and Weaver. She has published and presented extensively on printmaking practices and visual culture, and curated several exhibitions at the Met, including the current show, Art for the Millions, American Culture and Politics in the 1930s, on view through December 10th, and definitely worth a visit. Today, she will present research related to this exhibition with a talk entitled Doc's Thrash, Carborundum Printmaking, and the Politics of Representation. Our second speaker is Sarah Mirseyedi, currently the Andrew Mellon Curatorial Fellow in Prints, Drawings, and Photographs at the RISD Museum in Providence, Rhode Island. Sarah completed her doctorate at Harvard University in 2022 with a dissertation on Edouard Manet and his engagement with the mass image industry throughout his career. Her fascinating work is of particular interest to us at the moment in light of our exhibition at the Met, Manet Degas, which was co-curated by Ashley Dunn in the Drawings and Prints Department and runs through January 7th of this next year. Sarah's presentation today is entitled Any Manner of Printing, Whether Industrial or Artistic, Behind the Technical Ambitions of Le Corbeau by Mallarmé and Manet. Our third and final presenter today is Rebecca Capua, conservator in the Sherman Fairchild Center for Works on Paper and Photograph Conservation here at the Metropolitan Museum. Rebecca joined the staff of the Met in 2009 with a graduate degree from NYU IFA Conservation Center. Her research has focused on printmaking within the circles of Japonisme in the United States and Europe, as well as on philosophical and historical issues surrounding facsimile display in museums. It is the first of these that she will present on today with a talk entitled The Role of Reproductions in the Development of a Japonisme Aesthetic. So I will turn it over now to Allison Rudnick, and I will see you at the end of the program. Allie.
Thank you so much to David and to Nadine for those terrific introductions, and to the full staff of the IFPDA, notably Jenny and Michelle, and to my colleagues here in the Department of Drawings and Prints at the Met, notably Joanna, for organizing this event. I am really pleased to be here. I will be presenting today on Doc's Thrash, Carborundum Printmaking, and the Politics of Representation. Though before I begin my talk, I just want to mention that during the print fair at the Javits Center on October 29th, which is a Sunday at 2 p.m., I will be in conversation with the artist Yeshua Kloss. I will have the pleasure of speaking with him about the subject of art and labor in the United States in conjunction with the exhibition Art for the Millions, American Culture and Politics, in the 1930s, which I organized for the Met, and about Yeshua Kloss's incredible mural, Our Labor, which will be on view at the Javits Center during the print fair. So please do make a note of that. And if you are visiting the print fair in person and are able to attend the talk on Sunday, October 29th at 2 p.m., it would be great to see you there. Now, I am really delighted to have the opportunity to be presenting today on the artist Doc's Thrash and Carborundum Printmaking. a printmaking technique that Thrash co-invented while working at a government-funded Philadelphia-based print shop during the late 1930s. And here on the screen, we have an image of Thrash on the left and the young artist Claude Clark on the right, who are posing together in the print shop for a promotional photograph that was taken around 1940. Now, this talk is a deep dive really into one aspect of Thrash's artistic practice, which I was inspired to present on today because his work is included in an exhibition that I organized, as I mentioned, for the Met, Art for the Millions, American Culture and Politics in the 1930s, which is currently on view at the Met Fifth Avenue through December 10th. The exhibition presents a snapshot of sorts of the visual culture of the United States during the 1930s, which were the years of the Great Depression and a decade of political and social upheaval, with a focus really on the transmission of political ideas and ideologies through a wide range of visual media. The exhibition is organized thematically, and one of Doc Thrash's works is featured in a section of the show that explores how artists engaged leftist politics and the attendant labor movement of the period. And you could see here on this slide that one of his watercolors is highlighted in the red rectangle at left, among many other works dealing with similar themes. Now, this work by Thrash is an untitled watercolor from around 1940. And it pictures here a union organizer hovering above a crowd, his commanding presence indicated by his outsized representation and raised fist. The crowd around him holds protest signs that protest high costs of living, World War II, and the Scottsboro Boys trial, in which 9 Black youths were falsely accused of raping 2 white women in Alabama in 1931. It is a rare depiction of people of color organizing and participating in a labor strike from the period, and particularly rare in that it is by a Black artist. Scholars have posited that the scarcity of such imagery is likely due to the frequent denial of union membership to workers of color during the 30s and later. And Thrash's inclusion of the placard in support of the Scottsboro Boys, which you see here, it's the placard at right and in the background, demonstrates an interest in fighting both racial and labor discrimination, which was shared by many activists at the time. The other work by Thrash included in the exhibition is featured among works that captured everyday life during the Depression, and with a focus really on the hardships that people, particularly in rural communities in the United States, faced during the 30s and early 40s. This is his Thrash's print, Georgia Cotton Crop, and it's really a slight departure from this theme because, its subject is a rural one, but it was likely inspired by Thrash's memories of growing up in rural Georgia decades earlier, around the turn of the 20th century, rather than a glimpse of the present moment. The work shows a family, a man and woman flanking 2 children at center, who and the children are holding each other's hands, who stand before a small, somewhat dilapidated cabin. And in my mind, at least, the print speaks to the strength and fortitude of familial relationships in the face of poverty and hardship. And that's very much a theme that is in keeping with works that were made during the years of the Great Depression. The dreamy, atmospheric effect that one sees in this print is very much characteristic of Carborundum printmaking. Now, Doc Thrash is best known among print specialists and enthusiasts for developing Carborundum printmaking, which is essentially an update on the mezzotint process using the industrial material of Carborundum, and I'll be expanding on the process in just a few moments. For decades after Thrash's death in 1965, and with a few important exceptions, Thrash remained largely understudied until 2001, when the Philadelphia Museum of Art mounted the exhibition Docs Thrash, an African-American master printmaker rediscovered. Its curator, the great John Ittman, published a catalog to accompany the exhibition, which you see pictured here on the left. And the catalog really remains the most robust and significant scholarly treatment of the artist. Now, over 20 years later, scholars, curators, and others are again reevaluating Thrash's work. Art for the Millions is one among many museum exhibitions which, over the last few years, have focused on the art of the politically fraught and culturally vibrant years of the 1930s and early 40s in the United States, during which Thrash was in his prime. Beyond the museum world, in 2016, a collective of designers, students, architects, and preservationists established the Docs Thrash House Project, an initiative to save Docs Thrash's home in the Sharswood neighborhood of Philadelphia from destruction, and one which has brought even more attention to the artist's legacy in recent years. Now, despite these recent initiatives, it is my contention that the full impact of Thrash's contribution to the history of printmaking and to art history more generally continues to be somewhat overlooked. In this talk, I situate Thrash's development of Carborundum printmaking within the broader socio-political context of the 1930s and 1940s American art world, specifically within the context of the New Negro movement, in order to illuminate how Thrash's innovations in printmaking techniques were understood within the discourse on Black self-representation that was central to the New Negro movement. So in order to understand all of this, we need to really explore Thrash's biography, and I'll be presenting a bit more about his life. Thrash was born in rural Georgia, as mentioned, around 1893, and was raised in a small cabin formerly inhabited by enslaved people in the area. And here on the left, we have again Georgia cotton crop, which we looked at just a few moments ago. And then on the right, we have the print Cabin Days. And these are both prints, among others, that Thrash, again, likely based on his childhood memories of growing up in the rural South. Thrash dropped out of school after the 4th grade, presumably in order to earn money, and left Georgia when he was 15 years old, settling in Chicago a few years later. While working various day jobs, he enrolled in evening courses at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago over the period of 4 years, until his studies were interrupted by the United States' entry into World War I in 1917. Thrash served with the U.S. Army for 14 months when he was sent to the French-German border to help provide relief to the French army, and where he was gassed, wounded, and suffered from shell shock. And he later created this watercolor. I apologize for the poor quality of the image. It's titled At the Front, and it's a look back on his time, of course, serving in the army and at the front. During the 10 years following the end of World War I, he completed his studies at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and he traveled around the United States in search of employment. In the late 1920s, he settled permanently in Philadelphia, where he worked as a commercial artist, designing posters and logos for local businesses. At this time, he also took courses in intaglio and block printing at Philadelphia's Graphic Sketch Club. His work from these years evinces his interest, in particular, in the prints of Rembrandt. Here's just one example of a print that he made in the early 1930s on the right. And one can see the kind of clear influence here of Rembrandt's printed portraits. So the print on the right is a study of a male model done in etching, and it is reminiscent in particular of Rembrandt's intaglio portraits of seated men, both in its subject, but also in its composition and in its technique. In this print, we see Thrash experimenting with how to achieve contrast between light and shadow using the black and white technique. And this is seen especially in the background of Thrash's composition at left, where Thrash employed cross-hatching to suggest depth against the figure, figure that he depicts here, just as Rembrandt did in his portrait. Then here, and I have to just apologize again for this poor quality image on the right, but by pairing these two works together, we again see the important influence that Rembrandt's prints had on Thrash during this period. We see Thrash's print of a nude model reclining at right, and it was done after Rembrandt's print of the same subject. Now, interestingly, this pairing seems to suggest that Thrash was seeking examples of how an accomplished printer, like Rembrandt, might render dark skin tones in intaglio without the use of aquatint, which has historically enabled printmakers to achieve tonal range more easily than through the application of the linear marks used in etching and engraving and dry point. The impression of Rembrandt's reclining figure seen here is from the Met's collection, where it's been given the title Reclining Female Nude. However, until recently, it was for decades generally thought to depict a Black African woman. And though most scholars today agree that the subject is a white female nude, in the 1930s, its title suggested that it pictured a Black figure, which might have been one of the things that really drew Thrash and to this image and really propelled his interest in it as he continued to experiment with depicting dark skin tones in etching. Now, shortly after Thrash moved to Philadelphia in the late 1920s, the stock market crashed, initiating the Great Depression. And in 1933, during his first year in office, President Franklin D. Roosevelt established the New Deal, a set of sweeping governmental initiatives aimed at reviving the economy. One of these initiatives was the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA, a government agency that employed millions of job seekers to carry out public projects. The Federal Art Project operated under the aegis of the WPA and provided opportunities for unemployed artists specifically. The Federal Art Project was organized by geographic regions, as you can see here, by West Coast, Rocky Mountain states, the Midwest, the South, New England, and Metropolitan New York, including New Jersey. And then, as seen in the poster at right, we could see that it was also organized by type. And it might be a bit difficult to make out on your screens, but the graphics on the map show that 49% of people employed by the Federal Art Project work for one of the fine arts units, which included mural painting, sculpture, easel painting, and graphic art. Under this last unit, graphic art, printmaking workshops were established across the United States, including in Philadelphia. Thrash was hired to work in the fine print workshop of the Philadelphia Federal Art Project in 1937. And though aspects of the hiring practices and management of the Federal Art Project were undoubtedly discriminatory, its top advisors made special efforts to establish egalitarian environments that could be held up as evidence of its alignment with the Roosevelt administration's democratic values. And so for this reason, the project provided many people of color and many women who had often previously faced barriers in hiring, visibility, and equal treatment in the art world writ large with unprecedented access to art-making opportunities. So though Thrash had studied at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and at the Graphic Sketch Club in Philadelphia, he was able to work as an artist full-time, really for the first time in his career, at the Fine Print Workshop, thanks to government support. The workshop was fitted for a variety of printmaking techniques, including intaglio and lithography. It fostered a lively atmosphere in which artists collaborated, shared ideas with one another, and experimented. And the development of Carborundum printmaking was really made possible because of this unique nature of the print shop. Workshop supervisor Michael Gallagher and artist Hugh Mezebov and Thrash together began their experiments with the technique in 1937 when they took carborundum powder, an industrial polishing grit used in the workshop for grinding down the surfaces of lithographic printing stones, and employed carborundum to roughen the surfaces of metal printing plates, allowing the plates to hold copious amounts of ink and print large areas of rich color. A few years after this discovery in 1940, the process was outlined in a technical manual published by the WPA and circulated to other artists who were making prints under the aegis of the Federal Art Project. And the manual included step-by-step instructions on how to make a carborundum print, including illustrations like the ones that you see here. Carborundum printmaking essentially modernized the centuries-old technique of mezzotint through the introduction of carborundum powder, a substance discovered in the late 19th century and primarily used in industrial contexts. Mezzotint enables artists to register a wide range of tones in their prints without having to rely on the buildup of lines, as in engraving or etching or dry point. It came into popularity really before the advent of aquatint, which also allowed the registration of a wide range of tones. Mezzotint and carborundum printmaking both entail the abrading of the surface of a metal plate so that the pitted surface holds ink. In traditional mezzotint, a lunette-shaped tool with a series of fine metal spikes is repeatedly rocked across the surface of a metal plate to produce a roughened surface capable of holding varying amounts of printing ink, a process that really can take several weeks to complete, especially when working on a large-scale plate. By applying carborundum powder to a plate under the pressure of a levigator, as seen in figure 3 at center, Thrash and his co-artists effectively improved the process of preparing the plate by making it more time efficient and less physically demanding. Plates treated with carborundum powder are also more durable than those abraded with a rocker, as in traditional mezzotint, thus enabling larger additions to be made. And the process also allows for greater tonality, owing to the fineness of carborundum. To form a design in the plate, the artist can either scrape or burnish into the prepared plate to achieve tonal variations using a process called carborundum mezzotint. And this technique is illustrated in figure 4 at right. The less common approach to carborundum printing is carborundum etching, which involves drawing on the surface of the prepared plate with an acid resist and submerging the plate into an acid bath. The pitted surface allows wide lines to be etched and to hold ink, while the areas that are not etched also hold ink in their pitted surfaces. Now, both carborundum mezzotint and carborundum etching entail working from dark to light rather than the other way around, which is, of course, one of the key characteristics of most intaglio processes. The raised carborundum ground surface holds ink and transfers that ink to the paper support when run through the press, while the areas of the plate surface that have been scraped, burnished, or treated with acid hold less ink and resist it completely. Now here we have Thrash's beautiful print Glory Be, which is a really a prime example of the wide range of tones and atmospheric effects that Thrash was able to achieve through this process. Thrash created dozens of portraits and figure studies in this new technique, honing his skill over the course of the late 1930s and 1940s and gaining international renown for his work during the period. Here we see impressions of Manda and Mary Lou in the collection of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and of Whiskers, which is at the Met. Thrash's carborundum prints were included in several WPA organized exhibitions in the late 30s and 40s that traveled across the country, as were works of many federal art project artists, really with the aim of serving the educational component of the federal art project by introducing the masses to trends in contemporary art and fulfilling the project's aim of cultivating a cultured American citizenry. Interestingly, Thrash's prints were also featured in several prominent exhibitions focused on African American art during the period, many of which were spearheaded by the public intellectual Alain Locke, a graduate of Harvard who served as a professor of English at Howard University. And Locke he was an incredibly influential figure during the period in the cultural sector in particular, for publishing several books on art, literature, and poetry by African Americans during the course of his career, and really with the aim of providing them with a platform and expanding mainstream narratives of American cultural history to include their previously overlooked contributions. Locke is perhaps best known for coining the term New Negro, publishing an anthology of texts and art under the same name in 1925. Locke organized the first major exhibitions of African American art in the United States, including the landmark show Contemporary Negro Art at the Baltimore Museum of Art in 1939. The exhibition featured paintings, sculptures, and prints by the leading Black artists of the period, including Jacob Lawrence, James LeSesne Wells, and Hale Woodruff. Locke also selected two of Thrash's carborundum prints for the exhibition. His watercolor, Griffin Hills, subsequently became the first work by a Black American artist to enter the Baltimore Museum's collection. Locke also selected Thrash's work for the Chicago Coliseum's exhibition, American Negro Exposition, celebrating 75 years of Negro achievement in 1940, and the American Negro Art 19th and 20th Centuries exhibition, which opened at Edith Halpert's prominent downtown gallery in New York in 1941. Here we have another image of presumably school groups visiting the Contemporary Negro Art exhibition at the BMA. Now, one of Locke's primary aims was to create a record of African American art, to essentially write the first history of the field and integrate the contributions of Black artists into the broader art historical canon. Thrash understood the significance of Locke's project, writing to Locke a letter following the publication of Locke's 1936 book, Negro Art, Past and Present. Thrash, in his letter to Locke, wrote, quote, "As a result of your book, the reason suddenly bore upon me that Negro art has not been fitfully recognized because we lacked critics of your type in our race, who were able to analyze the work correctly. Indeed, the term Black self-representation proliferated in the Black press during the 1920s, 30s, and 40s in magazines such as the NAACP's The Crisis, the Urban League's Opportunity, and the literary magazine Fire. In his letter to Locke, Thrash foregrounds the significance of the Black public intellectual in calling attention to the artistic practices of Black artists, as he had the ability, as Thrash wrote, to, quote, analyze the work correctly. In a similar vein, the discourse around Black self-representation that played out in the press put forth that it was up to Black artists to create images that represented positive, multidimensional, and nuanced images of Black contemporary life, ones which counteracted the dehumanizing force of racial caricatures that proliferated the visual culture of the United States. In a 1926 issue of The Crisis, W.E.B. Du Bois, the famed public figure and co-founder of the NAACP, who was a generation older than Locke, published an article on the state of photography. The article brought the topic of artistic technique into the folds of the discourse on Black representation, stating, quote, "Why do not more young colored men and women take up photography as a career? The average white photographer does not know how to deal with colored skins, and having neither sense of their delicate beauty of tone nor will to learn, he makes a horrible botch of portraying them," end quote. 14 years later, The Crisis published a profile on Thrash titled "A New Print Process," and you see the article reproduced here. The article outlines Thrash's role in discovering and perfecting Carborundum printmaking. It also draws a connection between the technique and the New Negro movement. Quote, "This new art medium has a special significance because of its wide range of tone in Black and white and its suitability for portraying Negro subjects. It is, therefore, particularly fitting that one of the artists who took on an active part in helping to develop this new medium, and the one who first roughened up copper plate with carborundum grains and made a crude sketch with an etcher's burnisher, is Doc Thrash, one of America's leading Negro artists." It is evident that one of the most explicit ways that Black artists of the 1930s and 40s could contribute to the aims of the New Negro movement was by creating nuanced images of their everyday lives. For Thrash, a printmaker, this required more than simply representing his friends, family members, and others around him through portraiture, figure studies, and genre scenes. It meant staging an intervention into the centuries-old medium of intaglio printmaking and making it his own. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Allison. And I will take it from here. Okay. So thank you to all of the organizers of this event. I'm truly honored to be a part of it. I am really excited to speak with you today about this print project, Le Corbeau, or The Raven, which was undertaken by Manet and the poet Stéphane Mallarmé in 1875 to share with a French audience the famous poem by Edgar Allan Poe, The Raven, which Mallarmé translated into French, and Manet produced several lithographs, illustrations for illustrating key parts of the poem. And on the occasion of the Manet Degas exhibition, which I'm really excited to see when I'm at the print fair next week, I just want to mention, I won't be talking about Degas today, but the spirit of experimentation and technical curiosity that I'll be digging into here today with Manet was very much something that both Manet and Degas shared. and is just yet another point of synergy between the two artists' work. So the illustrations for Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven by Manet occupy a rather ambiguous position in the history of Western printmaking and in modern art as a whole. It's first conceived in the spring of 1874. This project grew out of a desire not only to promote the work of the American poet for a French audience, but also to pursue a novel form of artistic collaboration, one that had few precedents in the 19th century. At the same time, scholars in the century since have struggled to position this suite of prints within Manet's career as a whole, and especially alongside his other printmaking endeavors. As a founding member of the Society of Painter Etchers, for example, Manet has been recognized for his experimental and expressive approach to the etching medium, such as we see here in his 1862 etching after his painting Lola de Valence. And as a lithographic artist, he is likewise celebrated for marshaling the unique visual language of the lithographic crayon on flat stone to deliver biting political statements, such as Civil War from 1871, which you can see here on the right. So what do we make of these strange and brushy raven illustrations, which have often been described as not exactly the most masterful examples of Manet's work in printmaking, but still undeniably arresting in their ability to evoke the mood and mystery of Edgar Allan Poe's poem? In fact, at the time of their publication, the public found these prints so unusual that many viewers did not even know the exact technique they were looking at, often referring to them as etchings in contemporaneous critical reviews. A friend of Mallarmé's even went so far as to say, referring to the last print in the series of The Empty Chair, "It is so far out of the reach of my appreciation that I hardly know where to class it." It was not until much later in the 20th century that Manet's illustrations for The Raven and their mysterious methods of production would receive sustained scholarly attention. In particular, around the mid-1980s, the prints would take center stage in a debate about the complex landscape of 19th century commercial and industrial printmaking and Manet's role within it. Around 1984, several scholars had begun to suggest that the print technique used was not in fact a method of transfer lithography, as was originally thought, but rather a mechanical and perhaps even photomechanical transfer relief process that belonged more to the realm of the mass image industry than to the world of avant-garde artistic production. This new attribution stemmed from the fact that the documented printer of the Raven series, Joseph Lefman, was known primarily for commercial printmaking and more precisely for his production of transfer relief plates that would be printed side by side with text in newspapers or magazines produced at a large scale. In other words, Lefman was almost exclusively associated with cheap and reproductive images, as opposed to the kind of fine art printmaking we would expect of Manet. Seen here on the screen is a pamphlet that Lefman and his business partner, Charles Lordel, published in 1872 to advertise their newly patented relief printing technique, which they called phototypography. While they explain in this pamphlet that they also employed non-photographic transfer methods at their firm, advertisements and press announcements at the time focused almost exclusively on their development of a means of photomechanical transfer based on the properties of sensitized gelatin. And this process used by Lefman and Lordel was similar in many respects to the collotype process, which many of you may be familiar with, a process that also uses a substrate of photosensitized gelatin as a matrix that can be inked and printed. So the process described by Lefman and Lordel involved exposing a photographic negative onto a substrate of photosensitized gelatin. Because of the unique properties of gelatin, this surface, once exposed to light and then washed in water, develops hydrophobic and hydrophilic properties, much like a lithographic stone. This allows for the gelatin-based photographic image to be inked up like a printing matrix, as you can see here on the right. But rather than print this matrix onto paper, as would be done in the collotype process, Leifman and Lordell would instead transfer the inked image onto a zinc printing plate for further processing. And from this point forward in their process, the process resembles almost exactly the 19th century printing technique that we often refer to today as gilotage. This relief etching process was first developed by printer Firmin Gillot in 1850, and later updated by his son Charles Gillot in the 1870s to include the use of glass photographic negatives. As you can see in this demonstration panel for the gilotage process, which is housed today in the Musée des Arts et Métiers in Paris, the etching of the zinc plate in relief takes place over multiple stages and is a highly complex process. It was also, as you can see at the far left in the finished final print, a process that was mostly only suitable for the reproduction of a particular type of design, something that was very linear and had clear delineation between the image and the blank areas around it. And this is in stark contrast to the kind of brushy and calligraphic style that characterizes Manet's illustrations for the Raven. So for this and many other reasons, at the time of this debate taking place in the 1980s, scholars immediately took issue with the new technical attribution of the Raven illustrations as having been printed from relief plates through a process similar to gilotage. As Barbara Shapiro argued in a review in Print Quarterly, there was ample visual evidence to support the original claim that these were indeed lithographs, albeit highly unusual ones. For one, the prints of the Raven suite showed none of the telltale signs of relief printing, such as the embossing one might find on the verso of a relief print, or the particular way that ink tends to pool around the edges of a relief printed mark when compared against planographic examples. In particular, Shapiro pointed to the smoothing out of the paper at the margins of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts copy of Under the Lamp from the Raven series. As she argued, only a lithographic scraper bar exerting pressure on the paper atop the stone could be responsible for such marks, not the letterpress machines that would have been employed to print a relief plate. So regardless of the documentary linked to Leifman and his involvement with these kinds of mechanical relief processes, Shapiro concluded that we cannot ignore the visual clues offered on the surface of the prints themselves, that these were indeed lithographically printed, albeit still by Leifman himself. We know that Leifman was capable of, in addition to his activities making relief plates, he also printed more or less standard lithographs, such as what seems to be the case with this project here. And so by the end of the 1980s, all parties originally involved in this debate could more or less agree that Manet's illustrations were indeed transfer lithographs as they had been originally classified. But the success of having proven this definitive lithographic pedigree of these prints seems to have also overshadowed, in the decades since, several pressing questions about these works that still remain, specifically regarding the role that Joseph Leifman played as printer. We still don't know for certain, for example, whether the illustrations for the Raven were photographically transferred using the gelatin process or manually transferred by Leifman onto the lithographic stones. Even if we can ultimately agree that they were not the result of a relief etching process. Nor do we know why, if Manet had only ever intended to work within the confines of lithography proper, he did not turn to one of the numerous other lithographic firms serving Paris at the time, such as Le Mercier and Company, a firm with which he had had an ongoing relationship since the early years of his career. So there must be some kind of larger reason that Leifman was chosen for this project, or at least this is what I would like to explore as a possibility today. Excuse me. So regardless of whether the resulting Raven illustrations were typical of Leifman's larger body of work, or whether the prints, once finished, lived up to Manet's own expectations for the project, I'd like to explore why Leifman was approached for this project to begin with. And we know that at the end of the production process for the Raven, there were many aspects of the project that Manet and Mallarmé were unhappy with at the time of its publication in 1875. There were many technical delays in the printing of the plates, as well as typographic errors within the text. And in response to these issues, many last-minute decisions had to be made, resulting in aspects of the production that were not planned for ahead of time. But what I would like to argue today is that the choice of Leifman as printer was not one of these last-minute decisions, but was instead an integral part of the conceptual planning for this process. Given what we know about Leifman and his prominent position within the industry of commercial image reproduction, we must give thorough consideration to the reasons why this printer was chosen in the first place, and what these reasons might tell us about the overarching technical ambitions guiding Mallarmé and Manet in their project. If we return to the introductory text that Leifman and Lordell included in their 1872 pamphlet, we see that they make explicit mention of their openness to experimentation, but beyond the confines of the practices in which they specialized. As they describe, quote, "We are at the disposition of all who would like to attempt on a trial basis any manner of printing, whether industrial or artistic." So whatever Manet was attempting to achieve at the technical and material level with these illustrations, he seems to have considered it potentially unorthodox enough to seek out a highly specific genre of experimentation, one that belonged not to the avant-garde printmaking circles he was familiar with in Paris, but instead to the industrial and commercial field of image reproduction. Manet's first encounter with Leifman as a printer took place only a year prior to the start of the Raven project. In early 1874, Leifman made a relief plate after Manet's pen and ink drawing of a cafe interior scene, a politically charged subject for the time period, as cafes were notorious sites for political organization and dissent in the years before and after the Franco-Prussian War and the Commune that took place immediately after that. The resulting reproduction was printed in the February 1874 issue of the Belgian journal L'Europe, or Europe, a politically radical newspaper that had been banned in Paris under the strict censorship laws of the early Third Republic. The appearance of newspaper copy and Leifman's signature on the illustration that appears on the verso of the sheet leaves little doubt that Manet's drawing was indeed reproduced by Leifman's relief plate process, still most commonly referred to today as gilotage, as you can see here in the designation given by the Cleveland Museum of Art for this print. This was a time marked by politically motivated censorship of printed materials in the mass press. And within that atmosphere, Leifman's process offered a radical degree of transferability and flexibility that was no doubt appealing to Manet in the early 1870s. The fact that Manet's At the Cafe illustration was published at all in 1874 speaks to one of the major advantages of Leifman's printing operation. Manet could discreetly send his drawing to Leifman for transfer onto a zinc plate, and once made, the plate itself could be sent quite easily outside of France for printing and publication in Belgium. This stands in stark contrast to Manet's experience working with the major lithographic firm Merseyedi and Company for his execution of Maximilian lithograph from 1867 to 68, seen here on the left. When government censors barred this print from publication due to its incendiary political content, Manet had to take great pains to recover the lithographic stone from Merseyedi before the printer had a chance to grind down the image for the reuse of the stone. And working again with Merseyedi in 1874 on his lithograph Polichinelle, Manet would find himself in much the same situation, having to fight with the printing firm over the fate of his drawing on stone after the print was censored and blocked from publication. So the process overall appears to have been much smoother when working with Leifman on a politically charged print for this illustration, even though the Belgian newspaper it appeared in also faced censorship in Paris at the time. There is evidence of a working relationship between Manet and Leifman as they worked on this print as well. The final version of Manet's drawing that would appear in the newspaper was actually the product of a process of trial and error and back and forth between the artist and printer that speaks again to the relative ease and efficiency of using transfer paper rather than working on directly on a lithographic stone. For example, when the first version of Manet's drawing, which is what you see here on the left, proved to be too difficult to transform into a relief printing plate, Leifman simply asked Manet to provide another one, this time in a clearer and more linear style, more suited to processes of relief plate making. While unfortunately we know little about the exact nature of their correspondence during this episode, whether Manet was annoyed at Leifman's request to remake the drawing, totally unfazed, or something in between, it nevertheless stands out as a moment where Manet could learn something valuable about Leifman's methods of working and to come to conclusions about what might be gained from those methods when it came time to embark on the Raven illustrations in 1875. It was around the time that both Manet and Mallarmé began to conceive of the Raven that there emerges another key insight into what Leifman's commercial and industrial printmaking process may have offered this project at the conceptual level. A critical essay that Edgar Allan Poe had first published in 1845 about a newly invented transfer relief process known at the time as anastatic printing had just recently been republished in 1873 in France as part of a new French edition of Poe's complete works. Both Manet and Mallarmé were in close correspondence with the publisher of this French edition of Poe's complete works, and they would have certainly been aware of this essay by Poe in which he lauds a new process of mechanical reproduction for its ability to democratize the publishing industry by putting the means of literary production into the hands of the authors themselves. Poe saw in the invention of new transfer-based relief processes, such as anastatic printing, a, quote, new regime in which the humblest will speak as often and as freely as the most exalted, and will be sure of receiving just that amount of attention which the intrinsic merit of their speeches may deserve. For Poe, the promise of anastatic printing not only lay in its democratizing potential, but also in the way it seemed to bring awareness to the material production of the text itself. Anastatic printing enabled writers to bypass standardized typesetting altogether and to disseminate their written manuscripts directly to the public as handwritten documents. As Poe argued, writers would therefore have to pay much closer attention to the act of autographic inscription in order to ensure the legibility of these texts for readers. In Poe's argument, the fact that this mechanical reproduction process might compel writers to be more aware of this graphic gesture, more aware of their own handwriting as a communicative site itself, was undoubtedly positive, as he saw a direct correlation between clarity of handwriting and clarity of thought. As a transfer-based relief process designed for facsimile reproduction, the anastatic process described by Poe in the 1840s was not very far off from the process developed by Leifman and Lordell in the 1870s. Both, it would appear, compelled their users to pay special attention to the mode of graphic inscription in the original. We have only to think back to this experience Manet had being asked by Leifman to redo his drawing for At the Cafe with more graphic clarity to see this similarity between the process that Poe is describing and the process here come to light. Though beyond the scope of my talk today, I see this experience that Manet had having to tailor his own personalized manner of drawing to the technical exigencies of Leifman's process. In other words, having to reject a certain degree of subjectivity of expression in favor of achieving more effective means of public communication. I see this as constituting an alternative avenue towards the same modernist self-reflexivity that both Manet and Mallarmé sought to address in their own ways throughout the 1860s and 1870s. And finally, there is evidence of a deeply practical benefit that Leifman's process offered, as it appears that Manet may have had plans for some version of his Raven illustrations to be reproduced in newspapers as part of the promotional campaign that both he and Mallarmé embarked on leading up to its release. Based on a letter that Manet received from the personal secretary of the editor of the newspaper Le Figaro, shown here on the screen, it appears that Manet had initially proposed that the newspaper reproduce, at the very least, quote unquote, the bird, perhaps referring to the simple profile of the raven that adorned promotional posters for this book at the time. Embarking on this reproduction of the raven profile in a newspaper, perhaps, would have required a relief printing process of the sort that Leifman was known for, as well as a significant scalar reduction of the original illustrations for printing in this separate media context. And so perhaps the appeal of a commercial and industrial printer like Leifman was precisely this kind of versatility and flexibility across media platforms. Leifman was not only willing to experiment with artists on novel approaches to printmaking, but he could also go one step further and help them reproduce their works on a potentially much wider scale than was even possible through the traditional lithographic firms of Paris. And so in the end, if the ambitions behind this project were indeed to include a desire to reproduce the Raven illustrations in media formats outside of the luxury book object, to explore in the spirit of modernist self-reflexivity the limits of the autographic gesture in drawing, and to do all of this through a technique that could bypass, if need be, the scrutiny of government censors, then we can certainly see why Leifman would have been an obvious choice for Manet and Mallarmé for this project. While there are unfortunately still crucial pieces of the puzzle surrounding the Raven missing, and my research on this project very much ongoing at this time, I believe that what we do know about this project, coupled with what we know about Leifman and his prominent position in the industry of commercial imagery production, makes any interpretation of the Raven and the role that it plays within Manet's of incomplete without this kind of consideration of what the field of industrial mass image reproduction may have offered and Manet and how it may have shaped the ambitions and expectations for what a collaborative printing project might look like in 1875. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I'm delighted to share this talk with you all. If there's one thing the average viewer knows about the artists associated with the aesthetic of Japonisme, particularly the French circle, including but not limited to Degas, Manet, Van Gogh, Vuillard, and Bonnard, it is that they were inspired by ukiyo-e woodblock prints by masters such as Hiroshige and Hokusai, and evolved a new aesthetic accordingly. So let's widen the focus. Following the opening of Japan to the West in 1854, the Japonisme of the 1860s, through subsequent waves in the early 20th century, was an international artistic movement expressed in literature, painting, printmaking, and applied arts and architecture, as well as a larger cultural phenomenon exhibited through a range of commodities for the home, and the new field that emerged to encourage the commodification of taste, advertising. The explosive success of Japanismo as a cultural moment cannot be separated from the particular conditions of an emerging industrial capitalist economy, an economy that produced monumental changes in the experience of art making, the role of artists, and what I will be focusing on today, following the theme of this session, the field of printmaking as it became stratified into mass reproductive printing firms versus printers more associated with artist prints. In addition to considering the influence of Japanese ukiyo-e on Western artists, we will examine the influence of the modernization of industrial reproductive printmaking on the mediums they chose to represent the Japanismo aesthetic. Excellent archival research has uncovered the sources and availability of Japanese art, including woodblock prints in Europe, beginning around 1855 to 1858, when trade between Japan and France officially began. Japanese prints were available in Paris even before Japan opened to the West in national collections, such as that of the Bibliothèque Nationale, having been acquired from Europeans living in Japan, like German physician and natural scientist Philipp Franz von Siebold, who assembled a collection of prints as part of an ethnographic and naturalist study of Japan. Availability followed demand, and imports of Japanese prints by both French and Japanese dealers living in Paris increased rapidly over the 1860s and 70s, especially following the Paris World's Exposition of 1867, where the Japanese pavilion and its displays of the various arts of Japan, including prints, was visited by millions. Import businesses were also meccas for artists and collectors. One such location was the Porte Chinoise, one of several vital Asian export shops owned by both Europeans and Japanese merchants. La Porte Chinoise opened in 1862 on the Rue de Rivoli and drew many Japanese to its doors where they mingled and shared ideas. The instances of artists' exposure to Japanese prints have at times assumed a mythological significance, emphasizing an artistic vision beyond mere shopping. Most likely apocryphal accounts from the late 19th century, such as that proposed by writer Théophile Gautier of Félix Braquemond, discovering ukiyo-e being used to wrap export ceramics, had details change over the years but became canonic tales establishing the artistic recognition of the value of Japanese art. Whereas for American artists who incorporated a Japanese-inspired aesthetic into their work, such as John Lafarge and Arthur Wesley Dow, some time spent in Japan was important to their development. For European artists, the experience of Japan was largely through exhibitions, shops, and publications. At this time, there was no real distinction between collectors, dealers, curators, and publishers, as several key individuals performed overlapping functions. Siegfried Bing was one such figure who played a central role in the dissemination of Japanese art to a Western audience. Bing was descended from a Hamburg dynasty of merchants and became one of the most powerful dealers of Asian art in Paris, with multiple trading companies in Japan and several storefronts in Paris as well as New York. He sold prints, bronzes, and ceramics in his Paris stores beginning in the 1870s, mounted exhibitions, and published the influential journal Le Japon Artistique in French, German, and English in 36 issues from 1888 to 1891. Louis Gons was another important collector, critic, and exhibition organizer. As chief editor of the Gazette des Beaux-Arts, he promoted Japanese art in the journal and organized the first major retrospective exhibition of Japanese art in 1883 at the Galerie Georges Petit, showcasing art in all media from his own collection and those of Philippe Berti, Théodore Duret, Siegfried Bing, and others. The expansive exhibition was immediately followed by his publication of L'Art Japonais, a luxury volume of essays and reproductions of Japanese prints and depictions of decorative arts. The publications of Bing and Gons, among others, supported the commerce of Japanese exports and French business interests in Japan, and helped drive demand for Japanese commodities for both the artists of the Japanese circle and the general public. Without the reproductions made for high-end titles such as L'Art Japonais and lower-tier variations which spread to mass-printed images, including advertising, it is unlikely that the Western world would have succumbed to what was contemporaneously known as the Japan craze or mania. The double-edged sword of mainstream appreciation for Japanese art was bemoaned by the very writers and collectors who had advocated for it. As the Japanophiles and collectors known as the Goncourt brothers wrote in 1868, in rather undemocratic terms, quote, The taste for things Chinese and Japanese. We were among the first to have this taste. It is now spreading to everything and everyone, even to idiots and middle-class women. The reproductions of woodblock prints were essential in demonstrating the ways in which a particular aesthetic aspect of Japanese art, whether it was perceived flatness or heightened color or elevated perspective, could be divorced from its context, translated to a different medium, and recontextualized for consumption by a Western audience, emphasizing some characteristics of Japanese prints while obscuring others. This process would not have been possible without the development of printmaking technology in the mid-19th century, including photographic transfers in lithography and photomechanical relief etching. The translation of one medium into another, particularly into a print, was nothing new. Artists had been copying paintings and drawings as prints since printmaking began, but it was only in the mid-19th century that different forms of printmaking began to take on a semiotic meaning in an increasingly hierarchized field, with intaglio printmaking at the top, above mass reproductive relief printmaking. Simultaneously, intaglio printmakers were struggling for differentiation and recognition as part of the emerging sphere of fine art, with its attendant cultural capital, and sites such as the national academies and institutions they had long been included. Lithography was somewhere in the middle. Color printing was seen as too vulgar to be truly fine art, offering opportunity to artists to establish their avant-garde bona fides, but it was also too inefficient to compete with the newly dominant mass publication techniques of wood engraving and relief etching. Comparing authentic woodblock prints to their form as reproductions can reveal important distinctions. However, there are many different examples of reproductions, as the process used for reproductions depended largely on cost, especially when it came to larger print runs. Sacred Things, Le Japon Artistique was the widest reaching publication of Japanese print reproductions, published in 3 languages and intended for both informed enthusiasts, featuring writing by well-known and respected experts, as well as general middle-class readers. Each issue featured around 9 color plates of reproductions of Japanese prints, stencil patterns, depictions of decorative arts, textiles, and paintings. Additionally, articles included black line block reproductions of woodblock prints, sprinkled liberally around the pages of text, both credited as after a particular artist and uncredited. The text-adjacent illustrations are either reduced in size or excerpted from larger compositions or both. The color reproductions of Japanese prints, and one assumes the black line blocks, were done by Charles Gillot, who we've heard about, a pioneer in the field of reproductive relief etching. He followed in the footsteps of his father, Fernand Gillot, who coined the term gillotage for his relief etching process of the 1850s, utilizing drawings or transfer drawings. In the 1870s, Charles introduced photography into the relief etching process, and the technique took over the field of reproductive printmaking due to its efficiency and quality. The reproductions were high quality and accurate, although slightly low quality and less costly than what would have been obtained through the specialized planographic holotype process, which is more capable of representing the gradations in tint that are used to great effect in Japanese prints. An example of the highest level of reproduction assembled in a publication would be Japanese Art Folio, edited by Hiromichi Shujio, director of the First Japan Manufacturing and Trading Company, and an influential figure in American Japanism. This luxurious monthly journal, published in Tokyo from 1898 to 1899, features reproductions in both woodblock for prints and black and white holotype for paintings. And you see here a photomicrograph showing the extremely fine holotype grain, and that's how you identify a holotype. It was printed by Ogawa Kazumasa, a leader of the development of photomechanical printing in Japan. Gillotage is more commonly known today as photo engraving, which I find slightly misleading because it involves etching. And it is also referenced as line block or zincography. To me, the most descriptive term for it would be photo relief etching. So that's the term I'm going to use. The process was the successor to wood engraving and other widely used relief process. Relief plates were essential for the mass reproductive image market because they could be printed alongside text, which accounted for the explosion in illustrated weekly newspapers in the mid-19th century. Gillot's process involved minute adjustments and expertise from technicians at every step in order to receive satisfactory results. To reproduce, for example, a Japanese print, the original was photographed, and then the negative was used to print a positive image directly onto a zinc plate coated with a photosensitive mixture of bitumen and benzene, which would harden on exposure to light, protecting the positive areas of the image from subsequent etching. The etching was done in stages with repeated application of acid-resistant dragon's blood resin to the plate to achieve the depth necessary for a line drawing to print without undermining the fine lines. For colored prints, Gillot and French printers in general tended to use the process of relief aquatint for color-separated plates. Viewed under magnification, these areas appear as a negative image of the pattern made by intaglio aquatint. Whereas intaglio aquatint is worked through acid biting in subsequent stages from light to dark, relief aquatint is worked from dark to light, masking the areas meant to appear darker until the most bitten areas appear pale or white. A roulette can be used to add further transitional tones, as we see in some of Gillot's prints, particularly along the edge of the green there. The drawback to using this technique to reproduce other media, such as woodblock prints, is that it has a limited ability to convey gradations in tone, even allowing for the added complications of the relief aquatint process. In Japanese woodblock printing technique, the inking of the block is done in a painterly fashion by a block painter, as each aspect of the process was handled by specialized artisans, and applied by brush. Additionally, the water-based inks used by the Japanese were much more transparent than Western oil-based inks, allowing for layering and blending of colors and a play between the more opaque ink mixtures and areas where the white of the paper shines through. In some prints, the trace of the woodblock grain, which absorbs ink differently across the different rings of wood growth, is as much a part of the print as the carvings of the woodcutter. Again, this is something that would be lost in reproductive prints. In order to approximate tonal gradations in reproductive relief printing, some linear translations of dots and lines, similar to what would be used in intaglio or wood engraving, were added to the key block. This could have been done on an intermediate transfer image between the photograph and printing the positive on the zinc plate, or by scratching the hardened positive image directly on the plate. For this reason, even though the gilottage process is a relief image, it very much shares the aesthetic of traditional intaglio printmaking, the preferred visual language of the otherwise innovative Japanese artists. It should be noted that for artists who gravitated towards lithography, such as Vuillard and Bonnard, the tendency was to represent color in flat, unmodulated planes. Bonnard wrote that following his own discovery of ukiyo-e, he saw that, quote, color could express everything without having to call on modeling or relief to help it out. It became clear to me that color all by itself could convey light, convey form, and convey character. Values need not be added, end quote. I would argue that this development, which played such a central role in the progression of modernism towards abstraction, is much closer to the aesthetic of reproductions of Japanese prints than of the prints themselves. Another major difference in the reproductions found in Le Japon artistique and authentic woodblock prints is the overall flatness of the page. The paper used for printing combination letterpress, text, and photo relief etching images tended to be quite smooth and non-absorbent for crisp deposition of ink and for cost effectiveness made from poor quality wood pulp paper. These characteristics are extremely different from the soft, matte, long-fibered Hoso paper used to print ukiyo-e prints. The water-based ink, generally pigment mixed with water and starch paste, is absorbed all the way through the sheet, and the lofty furnish of the paper allows for a very important aspect of woodblock printing, the embossing of different textures. Japanese Edo era prints were individually printed by hand, laying the dampened paper on the ink block and rubbing with the barin, with the printer able to control the amount of pressure over different parts of the print. Heavily embossed textures were used to add when holding the print in one's hand and letting raking light play over it. Printers were able to convey the textures of actual objects depicted in the print and had a level of refinement beyond just the lines and colors. This aspect of Japanese prints is largely lost in reproductions of ukiyo-e from this time, and unsurprisingly, what was emphasized in both reproductions and in descriptions from artists and connoisseurs of the time was the overall perception of flatness of the images, a term that applies to both flat planes of color without modulation, as well as planarity of the print, both of which were emphasized by the limitations of the reproductive print. Charles Gillot was also the printer of the color reproductions, largely of surimono prints in Gonza's L'Art Japonais. And although he used the same technique, for this luxury volume, the quality was much higher. Gold and silver metallic inks were added as they were a beloved characteristic of surimono prints, with several of the papers used flexed with mica, a common additive to Japanese paper used for higher quality prints. The paper used for printing these plates appears to be made from a Japanese Mitsumata based on a quick fiber identification using polarized light microscopy, although it is much thicker and stiffer due to heavy sizing than the paper traditionally used for woodblock printing, indicating a paper made for export to the West. Most notably, Gillot added a blind plate to incorporate embossed textures to a very pleasing effect. This level of quality was quite unsurpassed in Western reproductions of Japanese prints due to both the sumptuousness of the volume overall and the originals being surimono rather than ukiyo-e, which were considered to be a higher status and less commercial object. These publications of reproductions were popular and wide-reaching and often discussed by art historians as sources for inspiration for artists in the Japanese circle, interchangeably with authentic Japanese prints, which, it should be noted, in France at this time were mostly Meiji Japanese reproductions of earlier Edo prints themselves. Another interesting facet to the story that I don't have time to go into today. Reproductions and facsimiles of graphic works and artworks in general have become quite popular, distributed through publications, albums made by numerous societies of collectors and enthusiasts, as well as collected and displayed by academies and the developing modern institution of the museum for educational purposes and increasing access to works of art. The explosion of the printed reproductions depended on new printing technologies, as we have discussed, as well as changes in the field of printmaking. The result of the realignment of the formerly workshop-based model with the emerging capitalist factory-type labor was that workers were increasingly specialized, isolated, often taking piecework home with them, managed by factory owners rather than printmakers, and alienated from the final product. At the same time, photographic technology reduced the visibility of the engraver's labor compared to earlier, more interpretive forms of reproduction, such as the early stages of wood engraving. Against this background of labor upheaval and the commercial cost and time imperative associated with mass reproductive print images, artists involved in printmaking gravitated towards intaglio printmaking on one hand and lithography as an alternative reaction. The market for intaglio artist prints began to feature the artificial limiting of print editions, as well as a large number of proofs and additional states whereby slight variations of inking and paper selection could foster a collector's sense of discernment and expertise, bolstering the notions of selectivity and sensibility surrounding the idea of the connoisseur as a counterbalance to the modern consumer. The valorization of hokusai by French writers as equivalent to the old masters is often read as a challenge to the authority of the conservative academy, but at this time it also reinforced the aim of distinguishing fine art printmakers from the industrial printmakers, including through the new idea of an original print. Japanismo as a cultural movement was perfectly suited to this tension between the commercialism of the modern capitalist economy and the emerging concept of the connoisseur. In beholding the newly discovered arts of Japan, the connoisseur was free to obsess over minute details of rarefied objects, argue with other connoisseurs, and canonize its masterpieces afresh, without necessarily having to concern themselves with any established history or context. Accounts from Japanophiles are littered with accusations against fellow collectors and experts of crass commercialism, shallow appreciation for the truly great Japanese art, weakness for flattery and deception by merchants passing off inferior works, sometimes with anti-Semitic and racist undertones, and a general bemoaning, often with sexist undertones, of the intrusion of the general public on the territory of those who first recognized the greatness of the Japanese masters. But of course, the Japan craze was essentially about commerce. We should read the reproduction in Gance's book of this print of a silk weaver in light of the fact that the trade in silk was the most important economic tie between France and Japan. The Goncourts spent astronomical sums of money on Japanese art, but described it in their writings as an emotional obsession equivalent to pure and questionably transactional love, writing, quote, "You can only say that you are in love when you are ready to spend all you have on what you love, whether it is a woman or an object, an animate or inanimate artwork." The consumer and the connoisseur are exemplified, perhaps most perfectly in the context of Japanisme, as mirror images. For the artists of the Japanisme movement, the reproductive technology which enabled the aesthetic revolution they embraced was at the same time the embodiment of what they needed to distinguish themselves against. This as the forms of modernism took shape on the horizon. Thank you so much for your time. And thanks to my colleagues in paper conservation and the Department of Drawings and Prints. And thank you to Jenny and Michelle and the IFPDA for hosting today.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you, Allie. Thank you, Sarah. These were really fabulous talks. So, you know, real print geek material. And so I'm going to open it up to questions. I have a question actually for Sarah. I was just curious, the interaction of Manet and Leifman, the way you've described it is coming from Manet's side of things, but I wonder if Leifman might have had some idea of like broadening his own business towards more artistic kinds of prints.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great question. And I certainly think that that's a real possibility for sure. And I'm still trying to track down archives and documents on the side of coming from Leifman and his career, which are much harder to find than the correspondence from Manet's side of things. But absolutely, I think that that is would make a lot of sense for that kind of desire to cross the artistic commercial boundary to take place from both sides.
And did he do subsequent publications on that, in that vein?
So the vast majority of the printed material that we know of from Leifman are in the kind of newspaper illustration realm of things. As far as I've been able to find, nothing of the kind of caliber, so to speak, of the Raven project I've been able to find associated with Leifman.
Okay, I'm just going to encourage people to write their questions that they have. I'm sure there are many in the Q&A. For Allie, Samantha Deutsch asks, Thrash creates many variations of reclining nude women. What evidence exists that he was particularly inspired by Rembrandt's reclining nude and not simply exploring the canonical subject of the reclining nude itself?
Yeah, thank you for that. Great question. Yes, so Thrash did make many studies of reclining nudes during the course of his career. And the example that I showed in my talk is one of the earliest prints we believe that he made. It's from the early 1930s. And it was made during a moment when many of the prints that he was making, likely at the Graphics Art Club, evinced the influence of Rembrandt really on a kind of aesthetic, visual, formal basis, but also in terms of, as I discussed in my talk, the technique that he was employing. So, and this contention comes from John Ittman's catalog. So he really is the one who deserves the credit for this observation. You know, just using our kind of knowledge of what kind of techniques that Thrash was employing early in his print career, and doing a visual comparison of those prints and Rembrandt's, that's one, you know, one way in which we can make this argument. And then Ittman actually also points out that there was an impression of that particular Rembrandt print of the reclining nude that was included in an exhibition at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, I think in around 1930 or 1931, that Thrash may have seen. We obviously, I mean, I shouldn't say obviously, we don't have any hard evidence for that, but it does help to corroborate, in my mind, this argument and this connection that's being made.
All right. Sarah, how many copies of Le Corbeau were printed? Is the question.
So Juliette Burrow, who's done the majority of the kind of extensive research on Le Corbeau and the extant copies, she tracked down and documented about 230 extant copies of the portfolio of the book in collections around the world. I don't have the exact numbers on hand in terms of like the intended edition originally. I think that intended edition was much larger, and there were also copies that remained unsold at the time of its production in the 1870s that I think have been kind of lost track of. But at least today we know of around 230 copies.
All right, Rebecca, are the prints that you're dealing with mostly appearing in book publications, or did they use some of those methods for releasing like loose prints reproductions?
I think for these, and also just for reproductions in general of Western works as well, they're mostly either in like a journal publication, a few in books, like a lot of journals, or in albums that would be distributed to like sort of subscribers.
And would that have like the choice of technique would have had to do with like printing text as well alongside the?
Absolutely, I think that's key. Yeah, because they always include, you know, some essays and other little flourishes alongside the print itself.
All right. Any other questions? Maybe from you guys. Oh wait, we got a long one here from Deb Wood. The photosynthesized gelatin process Sarah described sounds similar to a process called gel lithographs, which was used for reproducing architectural drawings beginning around 1900, patented by French Dorel brothers. I'm curious, do you know what happened to those earlier gelatin plates from the 19th century? Were they melted and reused?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I actually am not familiar with the process that you mentioned, gel lithograph, so I'll have to look into that. In terms of what happens to the plates that date from the 19th century or around the turn of the 20th century, I do know that some of them have been preserved. There are quite a few things at in Paris at the Musée des Arts et Métiers, the kind of art and technique museum in Paris. They received quite a lot of things directly from printers in the kind of who are in the more commercial industry of things between around 1850, 1890s. And so there are quite a few that I've seen there. Yeah. But thank you for that suggestion of a kind of similar technique. I'll have to look into that.
Okay. Well,
can I just say one thing? There's a for anybody who's really interested in these industrial photomechanical techniques, there's a conference coming up in 2 weeks, which is being sponsored by the FAIC on this topic, and registration is closed now, but be on the lookout for postprints, which are going to be published. I think it's going to, it's definitely on the technical side, but if that's your interest, keep an eye out.
That's great. Well, it sounds like there's a lot of new techniques and all kinds of things to be discovered for prints of this period. So I think we are going to close it. Session. Thank you all. This has been really fascinating, really enlightening. And I will turn it over now to Jenny Gibbs.
Thank you, Nadine. And thank you, Joanne, for helping to organize this. Thank you, Sarah and Allie and Rebecca for sharing your research with us. And thank you to the 140 people who joined us today. It's amazing. Tomorrow we have our final Print Month webinar with Holly Borum, Curator of Prints and Drawings at the Blanton Museum, and she will be speaking about her recent research on the exhibition and catalog for the often surprising collection of Leo Steinberg. So I'm excited about that. David Tunick will also be joining the conversation again tomorrow to share some of his personal reminiscences and anecdotes from working with Leo. So that should be good fun. So we look forward to seeing you tomorrow at 12 noon Eastern. Thank you. Bye, everyone.